The great hall of Moonspire Kingdom smelled of roasted venison, burning pine logs, and power. Hundreds of candles burned in iron chandeliers overhead, their light falling in golden curtains across long stone tables, across goblets of dark wine, across the war-worn faces of alpha lords who had been eating and drinking and laughing since the sun went down. Wolf pack banners hung from the rafters, silver crescent moons, black wolves mid-howl, ancient symbols stitched into cloth so old the edges had started to fray. The floor was cold stone, worn smooth by centuries of boots. The windows were arched and tall and black with night beyond them. At the high table, above everyone else, King Oriana Valor sat very still. He was not the kind of man who needed noise to command a room. He had a quality that quieted spaces simply by existing inside them. His black crown sat against dark hair, its weight something he had long stopped noticing. His coat was deep charcoal, fastened with silver wolf-head buttons. His eyes were the color of a sky just before a storm, grey, watchful, giving nothing away. He had not spoken in several minutes. He did not need to. Around him, the alphas were loud enough for 20 kings. Lord Daxton Blaze sat 2 seats down from him, and Lord Daxton Blaze was very, very pleased with himself tonight. He was a wide man with a politician's smile, always showing too many teeth, and he had spent the last 10 minutes steering the dinner conversation toward a subject that seemed to delight him enormously. Gina Fenrir. 3 contracts, Daxton said, holding up 3 fingers like he was teaching a class. 3 separate engagements. All collapsed, and every single time, she found some way to make the man look like the villain. He shook his head with theatrical sorrow. The first, poor soul. She accused him of mismanaging funds before he could even move his belongings into the cottage. The second, she dragged into the council with some ledger she had kept on him. The third, he paused for effect. The third simply packed and left before she could ruin him publicly. The table laughed. Elder Kathleen Draven, seated across the table in stiff grey robes, folded her hands and nodded with practiced gravity. She is too proud for her own good. A woman in her position, land poor, family name half forgotten, should understand the value of a strong match. Instead, she makes enemies of every alpha willing to take a chance on her. Difficult, said Valerie Zane, from the far end of the table. Valerie was younger than the others, sharp-eyed and ambitious, always careful about whose side she was seen on. That is the word people use when they want to be kind. Impossible is more accurate. The laughter came again, easier this time, like something a crowd does when they have already decided an opinion and only need permission to say it out loud. King Oriana listened. He had never met Gina Fenrir. He knew the family name distantly. Fenrir land sat at the eastern border, and there was something about a sacred well on the property that appeared occasionally in old pack treaties. But the woman herself, he had never considered her. She was not his business. Still, he listened. He always listened. It was one of the few habits that had served him better than any sword. Daxton swirled his goblet and leaned back with satisfaction. The poor man who marries Gina Fenrir will lose his peace before the first moon. Mark that. For a moment, no one spoke. Then King Oriana said, quietly and without looking up from his own cup, I pity the man who marries her. He said it the way a man says something obvious, flatly, without fanfare. And because a king had said it, the hall found it twice as funny as anything Daxton had managed all evening. The laughter rose and echoed off the stone walls and rolled out through the open side corridor, where servants moved with platters and flagons. None of the laughing lords noticed the young woman standing near the entrance with a soup tureen balanced on her hip, completely still. Her name was Lyra Caden. She was Gina Fenrir's closest friend. She had been working the feast tonight because the pay was good, and the rent on her family's cottage was not cheap. She stood in the corridor for 3 more seconds. Then she set the tureen down very carefully on the nearest ledge, removed her serving apron, folded it over her arm, and walked out of Moonspire Hall into the cold night air. By sunrise, she was riding east. The cottage at the edge of Fenrir land was already awake when Lyra arrived. It was always awake before dawn, Mist hung low over the fields outside, the kind of mist that moved like something living, slow and pale and indifferent to the cold. The wooden door of the cottage was cracked open, firelight pressing through the gap in a thin, warm line. Inside, Gina Fenrir stood at the work table, with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, grinding dried root into powder with a stone pestle. Her hair was loosely pinned, several dark strands escaping already. There were ink marks on her left hand from writing before dawn. Her mother's old ledger lay open beside her, its pages covered in careful, precise script. Columns of names, amounts, dates, items given and received. She looked up when Lyra came through the door. Lyra's face said everything before her mouth could. Gina set the pestle down. She did not ask Lyra to sit. She did not rush her. She simply waited. The way a woman waits when she has learned that bad news does not become better by being hurried. Lyra told her everything. The feast, the laughter, the names, the exact words, in order. The mist shifted against the window glass. When Lyra finished, Gina was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, softly, "He has never met me." She said it without anger, without tears. It was a simple truth, and she offered it the way one offers a correction, not with fury, but with the quiet authority of someone who knows the facts better than everyone else in the room. She picked the pestle back up and returned to grinding. Lyra watched her, throat tight. "Gina, I heard you," Gina said. "Thank you for coming." Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. Only someone who knew her very well would notice the way her jaw had set, or the way her shoulders had drawn back slightly, not in defeat, but in the quiet gathering of something. Resolve, perhaps, or patience running out. An hour later, a royal summons arrived at the cottage door. The council seal was stamped in silver wax. The letter inside was formal and dense, and just barely polite. It informed Gina Fenrir that Lord Daxton Blaze had submitted a legal petition to claim partnership rights over Fenrir land for the purpose of protection and stability. A full council hearing would be held at Moonspire Hall. She was required to attend by Friday. Gina read the letter once, all the way through, without expression. Then she crossed to the cabinet against the back wall. Old oak, iron-banded, locked with a key she kept around her neck, and opened it. Inside were stacks of documents, organized by date, letters, land records, copies of old contracts, a slim journal, written in her mother's handwriting, evidence that she had been collecting quietly, carefully, for months, against the possibility of exactly this moment. She placed the council letter inside. She locked the cabinet again. She stood at the window for a while. Dawn was coming in now, pale gold spreading over the mist-covered fields her mother had planted, the boundary stones her grandmother had set, the old stone path that led down to the sealed entrance of the Moonwell, the sacred well that sat beneath Fenrir land, like a secret the kingdom had half forgotten. Her mother's voice lived in her memory, like a lamp that refused to go out. A woman who knows her worth will always frighten those who plan to spend her cheaply. Gina pressed one hand to the cool glass of the window. "Let them call me difficult," she whispered to the empty room. "By Friday, they will learn why." There was a version of Gina Fenrir's story that the noble packs of Moonspire Kingdom told at dinner tables and council feasts, and it went like this. She was a proud, ungrateful woman who had somehow destroyed 3 respectable engagement arrangements through stubbornness, bad temper, and an unnatural obsession with record-keeping. She had inherited a modest property at the kingdom's eastern edge and had spent the years since her mother's death refusing every reasonable offer of guidance or partnership. She was a problem. She was a burden. She was the kind of woman that sensible men learned to avoid. That version of the story was easy to tell. It fit neatly inside a single sentence and required no further examination. The other version required you to actually go to Fenrir land and spend a morning watching Gina work. She rose before the sun every single day. Not because anyone required it, but because there was always something that needed doing, and she had long since stopped waiting for someone else to review it. In the hour before full light, she prepared medicines, salves for joint pain, tinctures for fever, powders for the cough that spread through the border villages every winter without fail. She had learned everything she knew about healing from her mother, Gina Fenrir, who had believed that a woman with knowledge was a woman with power, and who had made sure her daughter understood both things equally. The cottage itself was not grand. The roof had been patched in 3 places. The hearth had a crack in the stone that let cold air in when the wind blew from the north, and Gina had learned to hang a strip of old leather over it in winter. The furniture was plain and worn smooth from years of use, but every corner of it had meaning. The herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling beams, the row of small labeled jars along the window shelf, the blue shawl hanging on the hook beside the door, her mother's shawl, wool gone soft with age, smelling faintly of lavender even now, and the locked cabinet. The cabinet was the one thing in the cottage that nobody who visited ever asked about directly, and Gina had noticed that people tended not to ask about the things that made them nervous. She walked the boundary of her land every morning after medicine preparation. The property was not enormous, but it was old, and old land in the Moonspire Kingdom carried weight that newer estates did not. The Fenrir family had held this eastern edge for 4 generations. The Moonwell, the ancient stone-lined well that sat at the center of a small sacred circle on the far end of the property, was older than any of it had appeared in founding pact treaties as a place of oaths. Its water had once been used in royal ceremonies, before the capital had grown too powerful to acknowledge its debt to older traditions. Marries Fenrir had been its keeper. When she died, that responsibility passed to Gina by bloodline right, whether the council chose to acknowledge it or not. The border children who lived in the outer villages came to Gina when they were sick, because the nearest council healer was 2 hours' ride away, and charged fees that most families could not afford. Gina never charged. She recorded every visit, name, ailment, medicine given, in her mother's ledger, which had long since run out of pages and now continued in a second book, and then a third. She treated a boy named Finn Harrow for a bone infection that the council healer had told his mother would require amputation. Finn still had both his legs. She treated an elderly woman named Winnie Kale for a lung inflammation that had kept her bedridden through 2 winters. Winnie now walked to the market every week with a walking stick Gina had carved for her from pine. She fixed fences herself when they broke, because the council had denied her repair requests 3 years running, claiming the allocation process required a male landowner's signature, and Gina had no husband, no father, and no male relative willing to attach his name to her paperwork. She had sent the requests anyway, unsigned, just to make sure there was a written record of the denial. The villagers who came to her at night, who knocked quietly after dark and left before sunrise, were the same people who crossed the street when they saw her coming in public, not because they disliked her, because they knew that being seen to support Gina Fenrir came with a cost, and their families could not always afford costs. She understood this. She had stopped being angry about it some time ago. The 3 failed engagements were something else entirely. The first suitor had arrived with charm and formal papers and an interesting clause buried on page 6 of the engagement contract that transferred management rights over Fenrir land to his family name upon betrothal, before any vows were exchanged. Gina had found it on the second reading. She had sent him home with the contract, the clause circled in ink, and a formal written refusal submitted to the council the same day. The second man had arrived 6 months later, with warm manners and hidden debt, substantial debt, the kind that required land as collateral. He had not mentioned this. Gina had discovered it through the same careful research she applied to everything, cross-referencing his family's public tax records against the council registry, noting gaps, writing letters, waiting for answers. When the answers came, she placed them before the council. The council had suggested she had misread the documents. Gina had brought 2 copies. The third suitor had a more specific problem. He had known about the Moonwell. He had known that Gina's legal claim over the Moonwell archive gave her, by ancient pack law, a vote in certain council decisions that no one currently wanted her to have. He had planned to marry her quickly, establish legal authority as her mate, and then file a council motion to transfer the archive rights to a neutral third party, which happened to be a firm belonging to his uncle. Gina had learned this from a letter his cousin had sent to the wrong address. The cousin had assumed the letter was going to Daxton Blaze. The name Daxton Blaze had appeared in her files 3 times now, adjacent to 3 different men who had tried to marry her for reasons that had nothing to do with her. She had told no one. She had only kept collecting. When Lyra rode back to her own home and the cottage was quiet again, Gina sat for a while at the small table by the window. The morning light was full now, warm and golden through the old glass. The fields outside were still. The path to the moonwell curved away between low hedges, empty and calm. Her mother had sat at this same table, had looked out this same window, had understood what it meant to hold something valuable in a kingdom where value was decided by people who were not you. They want the well, Gina thought. They have always wanted the well. And Daxton is tired of waiting. The summons sat locked in her cabinet. The evidence she had spent months gathering sat locked beside it. The king's words, "I pity the man who marries her," sat somewhere just beneath her sternum, small and sharp like a splinter she could not quite reach. She was not angry at the king. Not exactly. She understood what had happened. He had been handed a story, and he had accepted it without looking for the seams. That was a dangerous habit for a king. By Friday, she intended to show him exactly where the seams were. He made decisions based on evidence, and enforced them without apology. He had stopped 2 border wars, renegotiated 3 pack alliances, and once rode into a contested territory alone, just him, his wolf, and a treaty scroll, and come back with all signatures and no bloodshed. He was not a man given to carelessness, which was why, the morning after the council feast, the thing that kept returning to him was not the feast itself, not the wine, not the negotiations he had successfully steered over dinner. It was 4 words, "I pity the man." He had said them without thinking, which almost never happened. He had said them because Daxton Blaze had served him a neat little sentence, and he had completed it the way one completes a familiar phrase, automatically, without examining the words before he released them into a room full of people who were going to remember them. He stood on the palace balcony in the early morning cold, his coat pulled on but not yet fastened, and he watched the mist moving over the capital city below him, and he thought about the fact that he had passed judgment on a woman he had never looked at. He was still thinking about it when Lord Daxton Blaze requested a private audience before the morning meal. Daxton arrived dressed for a formal occasion, which was, Oriana had noticed, a habit Daxton indulged whenever he wanted something. Formality as performance. Clothing as argument. Daxton presented the petition warmly and with great efficiency. Gina Fenrir was unstable. She was destroying her mother's legacy through stubbornness and poor management. She needed the guidance of a strong alpha partner. He, Daxton, was willing to make a considerable personal sacrifice by taking on the burden of Fenrir land, and the responsibilities that came with it, because he believed in the health and stability of the kingdom's eastern holdings. It was a very smooth speech. Oriana had heard smoother. He watched Daxton's face throughout. Most people did not know that he did this, watched faces instead of words, because words could be arranged and faces were slower to learn the trick. What he saw in Daxton's face was not concern. It was something that sat underneath concern, dressed up in it, pressing against it from inside. Hunger. Daxton spoke about Gina's land with a particular kind of attention, the way a man speaks about a thing he has been studying, from a careful distance, for a long time, not the way a man speaks about a responsibility he has just noticed. Oriana did not sign the pre-approval order. He said the review would proceed in the standard manner, at Friday's full council. He thanked Daxton for his commitment to the kingdom's eastern territories. Daxton smiled and left. Oriana turned to his chief of staff, a quiet, efficient man named Corvin March, and asked for Gina Fenrir's file. The file that arrived was thin, alarmingly thin. Complaints without evidence. Statements from council members who all happened to share the same social circle. A summary of 3 failed engagements, written in language that made Gina sound like the aggressor in each case, without citing a single specific fact. Oriana read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk and looked at the ceiling. Something was missing. Either Gina Fenrir was a woman so chaotic that no one had bothered to document the specifics, or the documentation had been organized by people with an interest in keeping specifics absent. In his experience, absent specifics were never an accident. Then Corvin brought him a second letter, a sealed note that had arrived through standard petition channels, addressed to the Crown in formal legal script. From Gina Fenrir. It was not emotional. It was not angry. It did not mention the king's words from the night before, though she had clearly heard them. It was calm and precise, and structurally perfect, written in the hand of someone who had spent considerable time around legal documents. She requested the right to speak in her own defense, before any decision was made regarding her future, her land, or her mother's inheritance. She cited 3 specific pack laws by number and clause. She noted that none of the 3 previous engagement discussions had ever included a formal statement from her own household. She requested remedy. Oriana read it once, slowly. Then he read it again. "This is not the writing of a reckless woman," he asked Kathleen Draven, who had been on the council longer than anyone, and who had laughed the Draven, loudest at the feast, for any records relating to Gina's challenged engagement contracts. Kathleen brought him the complaints filed by the failed suitors. She did not bring him Gina's counterfilings. Oriana noticed that absence. "Were there counterfilings?" he asked. Kathleen's pause lasted 1 second too long. "I believe there may have been some informal correspondence from the Fenrir household, yes. I will have it located." She left. The correspondence never arrived. That night, Oriana stood on the balcony again, under a full moon. The city was quiet below. Somewhere in the palace, a fire burned in the great council chamber, where his own words still echoed. He imagined. In the stone. "I pity the man who marries her." He had said it in a room full of people who feared her enough to mock her behind her back. He had said it as a man who had read nothing, asked nothing, and known nothing. He had been a fool. He would not correct it with paperwork. He would correct it the way a man who had learned something painful ought to correct it, by looking at the truth directly. Before sunrise, he was dressed in plain dark traveling clothes. His royal seal and crown he left in their cases. He wore a simple wolf buckle at his belt, the kind any senior pack inspector might wear. His one companion was Axel Riker, his most trusted personal guard, a big, quiet man who had served him for 11 years and who responded to this kind of assignment with a straightforward nod and absolutely no questions. They rode east as the sun came up, following the border road through farmland and forest, until the terrain opened into the quieter, older landscape of Fenrir territory. The cottage appeared around a curve of hedgerow, nestled against the morning light. Wood smoke rose from the chimney in a thin straight line. The fields around it were neatly maintained, the boundary hedges trimmed, the stone path clear. Outside the cottage door, a woman was kneeling in the mud beside a small child, a boy of perhaps 7, his arm cradled in a cloth sling, his mother hovering anxiously a few steps back. The woman kneeling was speaking to him, low and steady. Her voice, carrying just enough for Oriana to hear. "You are very brave, and this will feel cold for a moment," before she pressed a cloth compress against the child's arm with hands that moved with perfect economy of motion, trained and precise. She was not a beautiful woman in the way that court artists painted beauty. She was sharp-featured and serious, and her hair was doing at least 3 different things, because she had pinned it up quickly, and it had declined to cooperate. There were herb stains on her apron, and ink on the side of her left hand, and she had not slept enough. Anyone could see that. There was a weight around her eyes that spoke of too many early mornings stacked on top of each other. But there was something in the way she held herself while kneeling in the mud beside that child, some quality of complete and unhurried attention, that stopped Oriana at the gate. He had come expecting arrogance. He had ridden east prepared to find the story Daxton had sold him. What he found was a woman whose hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion, who was nonetheless, precisely, completely, unhesitatingly present for this child who could not pay her. He stood at the gate for a long moment. Then he pushed it open and walked in. Gina saw him before he reached the gate. She had been watching the road from the corner of her eye since she first heard hoofbeats. The way a woman who lives alone at the border learns to track unfamiliar sounds. 2 horses, moving at a measured pace. Careful, not rushed. Not official pace, but not casual pace either. Somewhere in between. She looked up once, briefly, as they came around the hedgerow, and she recognized him immediately. She had seen the king's portrait in the council chamber records. She had seen his seal on every document that had ever arrived at her door, and she had noticed, even at this distance, the way he carried himself, not with performance, but with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time being the most powerful person in every room, and had stopped needing to prove it. He was wearing plain clothes, no crown, no wolf pack insignia. He was pretending to be someone else. Gina looked back at the child, completed the dressing on his arm, spoke quietly to his mother about keeping the compress clean, and let them go. Then she stood, wiped her hands on a cloth, and waited for the king of the Moonspire Kingdom to walk across her yard, pretending to be a royal inspector. He introduced himself as Valor. Just Valor, an inspector from the Crown Land Office, here to review border property records in advance of council proceedings. Gina looked at him. His glove had ridden up slightly on his right hand, and the royal signet ring, the black wolf's head on a silver band, unmistakable to anyone who had spent time looking at council seals, was visible above the leather. She let the silence sit for exactly 2 seconds. "Welcome to Fenrir land, Inspector Valor," she said. "Come inside." She would let him watch. It was, she had decided in that 2 seconds, more useful than confronting him. Let the king of the kingdom see what his kingdom actually looked like from here. He stood just inside the door while she resumed work at the work table, which Gina approved of. 1 unexpected visitor was manageable. 2 would have crowded the room. Widow Winnie Kale arrived at the cottage 20 minutes later for her weekly check-in. Gina gave her a month's supply of the lung tincture, refused the small coins Winnie tried to press on her, and walked her to the gate with one arm linked through the old woman's. A young man came next. From the farthest border family, asking for the fever remedy for his youngest daughter. Gina had it ready. She kept a standing supply for that family, because the youngest had been ill 3 times this year. Through all of it, the king watched. He was good at watching. She would give him that. He stood against the back wall with his arms at his sides and his expression neutral, and he asked nothing, demanded nothing, took up no more space than necessary. But his eyes moved constantly, across the ledger open on the table, across the cabinet, across the jars along the window, across her hands as she worked. She felt his attention like something physical, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in the way that a fire makes you aware of its heat from across a room, a steady, specific warmth you have not chosen, but cannot pretend you do not feel. When the visitors had come and gone, and the cottage was briefly quiet, he spoke. "You keep records of everyone you treat. Every name, every date, every medicine given," Gina said without looking up. "If someone challenges my work, I want the facts available." "Has someone challenged your work?" She looked up then, held his gaze. "Inspector Valor," she said. "Why are you really here?" His jaw shifted slightly. Something in his expression changed. A hairline shift, almost invisible, like a mask that had moved 1 millimeter to the left. "I am conducting a standard review." "You are not from the Crown Land Office," she said. "And there is nothing standard about a review conducted under a false name 2 days before a council hearing." He was quiet. She turned back to her work. "You do not have to tell me who you are, but I will not pretend I do not know." And it was not an empty silence. It was full of things. His discomfort, her patience, the low crackle of the fire in the hearth, the smell of drying herbs and pine smoke, and something else, something quieter, the particular quality of 2 people in a small room, suddenly and sharply aware of each other. He recovered himself. He asked careful questions about the land, the boundaries, the moonwell. She answered with quiet precision, giving him facts without offering him anything more, watching him the way she watched everyone, steadily, completely, storing information. She noticed that he listened without interrupting. She noticed that he asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he had actually heard her previous answer. She noticed that when she said something that surprised him, He showed it only in the brief stillness before his next response. She noticed that she was noticing all of this, and filed that away too. Then Daxton's men arrived. There were 3 of them, in black council livery, carrying a formal notice stamped with Daxton's personal seal. They pushed through the gate without knocking. The lead guard was a tall, hard-faced man named Breck, who had done Daxton's intimidation work for years, and who had developed a style that sat just inside legal behavior, while creating the impression of something much less restrained. He told Gina that the Moonspire Council had granted Lord Blaze preliminary inspection rights over the Fenrir Moonwell property as part of the pre-hearing process. He had authority to enter the sealed chamber. Gina set down her pestle. "Show me the authorization document," she said. He showed it. She read it. She read it again. Then she walked to her cabinet, unlocked it, removed 2 separate documents, and placed them on the table. "The authorization you are carrying cites Council Motion 47, subsection 3, she said. Council Motion 47 was superseded by the Fenrir Heritage Charter of 4 generations ago, which grants the current bloodline keeper exclusive access to the Moonwell archive until formal legal transfer is completed. No petition currently before the Council qualifies as completed. Lord Blaze has no access rights today." It was a small step, barely a step, but it was toward her mother's documents. The man standing against the back wall moved. He had not spoken since the men arrived. He had simply been there, still, watching, arms loose at his sides. But when Breck's hand reached toward the cabinet, he crossed the room in 4 steps and placed himself between the guard and the table. And when he spoke, his voice had changed completely. It was not Inspector Valor's voice anymore. "Remove your hand." 2 words. Flat as a stone, dropped from height. The kind of voice that did not rise, or harden, or threaten. It simply stated, with absolute certainty, a thing that was going to be true whether or not Breck decided to accept it. All 3 guards froze. Breck looked at the man in the plain dark coat, and took 1 full second to process what his instincts were shouting at him, stepped back, and gathered the authorization paper from the table with careful, deliberate movements. They left. The gate clicked shut behind them. The cottage was quiet again. Gina looked at him. He was still standing between her and where Breck had been, not quite facing her, and she saw the moment he remembered where he was and who he was pretending to be. She saw him let out a slow, controlled breath and turn. "Inspector Valor," she said softly. "Next time you come to inspect a woman, at least have the courage to use your own name." He did not deny it. He looked at her directly, and for the first time that morning, there was nothing careful in his expression. He said, quietly, "You knew from the moment I walked in." "Yes, and you said nothing. I wanted you to see something, without the weight of your own title in the way." Room. He absorbed that. Then, "I owe you an apology. For the disguise." "The disguise," Gina said, "is not the worst thing you owe me an apology for." His gaze held hers. He understood. She turned back to the table and began closing the jars she had opened during treatment. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke again, was measured and low. "You pitied the man who would marry me, because strangers told you I was hard to love. You heard their words, and you offered yours to agree with them. And now you have seen one morning of my life." She paused. "Tell me, King Oriana, do you always let cowards teach you wisdom?" He had no answer. He stood in the doorway of her mother's cottage with winter light on his face, and the weight of the crown he wasn't wearing, heavy in the air between them, and he had absolutely nothing to say. He stayed. She did not ask him to. He did not announce that he would. But after the guards had gone, and the silence had settled, she picked up her mother's old cloak from the hook beside the door, and he simply fell into step beside her as she walked toward the back of the property, and neither of them made a point of it. The path to the Moonwell was narrow and hedged on both sides, old stone showing through the grass, where centuries of feet had worn the path into the earth. The morning had gone quiet around them, the mist fully lifted now, the sky overhead a pale, washed blue. Frost still lived in the grass on either side of the path, melting slowly in the strengthening light. The moonwell itself was older than anything else on the property. Older, perhaps, than the council hall where men had laughed at Gina's name 2 nights ago. It sat inside a ring of standing stones. Low grey pillars worn smooth by weather and time, each one carved with a different pack symbol from a period before the kingdom's current alliances had been formed. The well itself was sealed with a stone cover, and above the stone cover sat a second layer, iron-banded wood with a lock that required 2 keys, or in the absence of keys, 2 specific bloodlines pressing against the metal simultaneously. Gina had one half. Her mother had told her where the other came from. She stood at the edge of the stone circle and looked at it the way she had looked at it her whole life, with a kind of inheritance that went beyond ownership, that sat in the blood rather than in any document. The Moonwell appeared in the original Moonspire founding treaties, she said, not as property, as a sacred site. The Fenrir family were named its keepers because we were the oldest bloodline in this part of the territory. The keeper's role was not just symbolic. Whoever controlled the Moonwell archive had a witness right in council, a vote that had to be recognized before any major pack oath was confirmed. Oriana said nothing. He was looking at the standing stones with different eyes than he'd entered with. My mother believed that certain members of the council had known about that right for some time, Gina continued. She believed they had been working, systematically, to get someone of their choosing into a position of control over this property, either through debt, through inheritance challenge, or through marriage. The attempt is documented in the archive. My mother found the records 8 years ago and copied them before the originals could be. She paused. Before anything could happen to the originals. There was something in the air between them now that had not been there before. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something that comes before warmth, recognition. The feeling of 2 people looking at the same thing from the same angle, finding, to their mutual surprise, that they see it the same way. The archive can be opened, she said, but not by me alone. The seal requires 2 bloodlines, Fenrir and Royal Valor. She knew someone from the Valor line would, eventually. She paused. She died before she could be sure when. They stood in the stone circle. The frost in the grass caught the light and made the whole area glitter faintly, like something watched over by something older than either of them. He offered his hand over the iron seal. She placed hers beside it. The lock gave way without ceremony. Not dramatically, not with light or sound. Just the quiet resolution of something that had been waiting a long time to be opened. They lifted the wood cover together. The archive below was a shallow stone chamber, and inside it, carefully preserved in sealed leather cases, were documents. Dozens of them. Some crisp, some aged to translucence. They lifted the cases out carefully and carried them to the flat stones at the circle's edge. Oriana proved himself useful. He was methodical, organized and patient, and he read without editorializing, which she appreciated. They worked through the cases in order, oldest to newest, the way her mother had taught her to approach archives. The older documents confirmed what Gina had already suspected. Daxton's grandfather had indeed attempted to claim the Moonwell through a fraudulent debt arrangement. He had been stopped by council investigation and stripped of the specific claim, but the stopping had been recorded vaguely, and the Blaze family had apparently treated the vagueness as an opportunity. Then they found the missing page. Or rather, Gina did not find it where she expected to find it. She would find it later. What they found in the archive was a preliminary record, enough to show that Daxton's current petition used language nearly identical to his grandfather's fraudulent claim, enough to raise serious questions, but missing one connecting document that would make the argument airtight. The connecting document was the piece Gina's mother had hidden separately. Before they could discuss this, smoke appeared on the horizon. Not near the Moonwell, the shed at the back of the cottage yard, the one that held Gina's winter supply stores. It was burning. Not fiercely. It had just started. Thin grey smoke rising against the blue sky, but burning deliberately. There was no lightning. The morning had been dry. A warning. Gina was running, before she had decided to run. Oriana was beside her. Axel Riker, who had stationed himself at the cottage gate and noticed the smoke first, was already shouting for the nearest village men as they ran. They contained it. The shed was lost, but the cottage was not. Villagers came with water buckets from the garden cistern, forming a line, passing and emptying, with the focus of people who understood what a border cottage fire could become. Gina worked the line, calling out instructions, her voice steady and carrying. When the fire was down to ash and the shed was a blackened frame, she pushed past Axel and went into the cottage. The cabinet. The documents. Oriana found her inside 30 seconds later. She was coughing from the smoke that had gotten in through the open windows. Coughing, and still trying to check the cabinet locks, her eyes streaming from the irritation, her hands working the key with shaking fingers. He put his hands over hers to still them. "It is locked," he said. It held. "The documents are here." She stopped. Took a breath that didn't quite come out steady. He stepped back. He could feel the heat still rising from the cottage walls. And he watched her pull herself straight again. The long, slow breath, the deliberate settling of her shoulders, the way she became composed by visible act of will. He had watched commanders do it before battle. He had never watched a woman do it in her own burned kitchen. He said softly, "You do not have to stand alone tonight." She looked at him. "I know how to stand alone. I am not questioning whether you can." His voice was low. "I am asking whether you should have to." Something crossed her face. It was not weakness. It was the recognition, briefly unguarded, of exhaustion, the kind that has gone on long enough to become the shape of a person's days. Then the guard returned, but more slowly than before. She reached for the blue shawl on its hook, the last thing she grabbed before the fire, he realized, the thing she had gone back for, and her hands stopped on the cloth. She felt something inside the hem. She lifted the shawl carefully, turned it in her hands, and felt along the bottom edge where the wool had been double-folded. Something crinkled. She worked the edge apart with careful fingers and drew out a single folded page, protected from time by the layers of wool around it. She unfolded it, read it. Her face changed. "My mother stitched it into the hem," she said quietly. "She put it where I would always touch it. Every time I reached for the shawl." She held out the page. He took it and read it. It was a transfer authorization, the connecting document, the exact missing piece. In Gina Fenrir's careful script, dated 3 months before her death, recording a specific set of transactions that tied Daxton's current petition language to the fraudulent original claim by name. Friday was tomorrow. One day. Gina looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the villagers were still working, clearing ash, talking in low voices, moving through the cooling evening air. "This ends it," she said. "If we can present this before the full council." "We can," he said. She noted the "we" and did not comment on it. But something in her eyes shifted, very slightly, almost nothing, like the first grey light that arrives before actual dawn, and is not quite light yet, but is no longer full dark either. Moonspire Hall looked exactly as it had 3 nights ago. The candles burned in the same iron chandeliers. The wolf pack banners hung from the same raftered ceiling, the same stone floor, the same high table where the king sat at the center of everything. Elevated above the council members ranged below him in their formal seats. But this morning the feast was gone. The goblets were gone. In their place were water jugs and document cases, and the particular tense silence of a proceeding that everyone in the room believed they already knew the outcome of. Lord Daxton Blaze stood at the council floor, in formal black, his lawyer beside him with a leather case of papers, and he wore the expression of a man who has already written the next chapter, and is only waiting for the other participants to catch up. Elder Kathleen Draven sat with her hands folded, and her face arranged in careful neutrality. Valerie Zane sat to her left, watching the room more than the proceedings. The gallery was full. Word had spread, as it always did in kingdoms where gossip moved faster than official proclamation, that the Fenrir hearing was happening today, that Lord Daxton was petitioning, that Gina Fenrir would be there. People had come to watch what they expected to be a manageable humiliation. Gina entered alone. She wore a dark blue gown, simple, well cut, without court decoration. Her hair was pinned properly, but without ornament. She carried her mother's ledger under one arm, and the archive page in a sealed case in her other hand, and she walked the length of the hall without looking at the gallery, without looking at Daxton, without looking at the council members who had laughed at her name. She looked at the floor in front of her feet, and then at the council stand, and then she stood where the respondent was meant to stand, and she waited. She had chosen not to look at King Oriana yet. She would when it mattered. Daxton's lawyer presented first. He was thorough, well-rehearsed, and deeply misleading. He painted a picture of Fenrir land in crisis, mismanaged, declining, a burden to the eastern border. He characterized Gina's 3 failed engagements as evidence of social pathology. He cited the council's letter of concern, signed by Kathleen Draven and 4 others, which described Gina as an unstable presence in the border territory. He presented Daxton's petition as an act of generous stabilization, not personal interest. He spoke for 20 minutes. He was very good. The gallery was very quiet. Then Daxton was invited to add personal remarks. He spoke less smoothly in this format. He was better in dinner rooms than in formal proceedings, but he hit the important notes. He expressed concern, generosity, and a carefully calibrated form of pity for Gina's situation. Gina listened to all of it. She did not move. She had the stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular moment to arrive. Then King Oriana spoke. He did not clear his throat. He did not make a preamble. He simply said, into the silence after Daxton's closing remarks, Lord Blaze, 1 question. The chamber fell completely still. The debt document you have submitted, the one dated from 40 years ago, establishing the original Fenrir liability, where was it held between its creation and the moment you introduced it to the council records? Daxton blinked. In the Blaze family archive, as the holder of the original, standardized after the borderland reforms, Oriana said. His voice was completely level. Those reforms took place 23 years ago. The document is dated 40 years ago. The signature format did not exist when this document was supposedly created. The chamber moved. Furthermore, Oriana continued, the Fenrir family seal on the authorization clause is an inversion of the actual seal. It is correct in every detail, except that the moon in the crest faces left rather than right. Every genuine Fenrir document in the council's own records shows it facing right. He lifted one of the archive documents from the case Axel Riker placed before him. Everyone, including documents from before Marilyn Fenrir's death. Daxton's lawyer said something. Daxton said something over him. Kathleen Draven sat very still. Oriana did not raise his voice. Lord Blaze, 3 of the suitors who attempted to arrange marriage contracts with Gina Fenrir in the past 4 years had documented financial ties to the Blaze family trading house at the time of their approaches. A 4th suitor, the most recent, was corresponding with your office directly regarding the Moonwell archive rights while his courtship was ongoing. I have the letter. He placed it on the council table. The petition before this council is not an act of concern for the eastern borders, Oriana said. It is a continuation of an attempt that began with your grandfather and has been pursued through 4 different men and 4 separate attempts for the purpose of claiming Moonwell rights that do not belong to the Blaze family and that cannot legally be transferred without the current bloodline keeper's genuine, uncoerced consent. Daxton stood up. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. He shook it off. Your Majesty, these accusations are documented, said Oriana. He placed the archive page on the table. Marilyn Fenrir's handwriting. Marilyn Fenrir's seal. The dates, the names. The transaction record that connected 4 generations of Blaze family interest to the Moonwell through a chain of failed manipulations, each one carefully recorded by a woman who had known exactly what was coming and had prepared accordingly. The chamber erupted. Oriana let it run for 30 seconds. Then he spoke, and the room found quiet again, the way rooms always did when he used that particular register of voice. He stood. He turned toward Gina, and the chamber understood. In the collective held breath of people watching something they did not expect, that something was about to happen that was not in any petition schedule. Before I met Gina Fenrir, Oriana said, I judged her by the voices of people who feared her strength. I said, I pitied the man who would marry her. He paused. That statement was careless, unworthy, and false. The hall was so quiet that the candle flames barely moved. Gina stood at the council floor, and she looked at him, and her expression was not soft. It was not forgiving. It was the expression of a woman who is listening carefully to words she has waited a long time to hear, who is not yet sure they are enough. He continued, I do not pity the man who marries her. I pity the kingdom that nearly mistook its bravest woman for a burden. Valerie Zane had gone white. Kathleen Draven was staring at the table. In the gallery, someone started to say something, and then stopped. Then Daxton. Because Daxton was Daxton. Because he had been playing this game for longer than most people in the room. Because he had one move left, and he was not a man who accepted a closed game without trying. Said, clearly enough for the council to hear. The petition's validity is a separate question from the underlying law. Under the old Border Stability Act, if no alpha of equal or greater rank claims partnership with the Fenrir land by Friday's sunset, the petition can be resubmitted by any council member. My submission stands regardless of its origins. He was not wrong. Oriana knew it. Everyone who knew the old pack laws knew it. The chamber went cold in a different way. Oriana stepped down from the high table. Not as a formal motion, simply as a man who had something to say that required less distance. He stopped a few feet from Gina and looked at her directly. Not a king looking at a subject, a man looking at a woman whose answer he did not know. He said, low enough that the chamber had to strain to hear it. There is one way to end this by Friday. But I will not offer it unless you believe I see you clearly. Gina left the council chamber without giving him an answer. The gallery watched her go. The council watched. Daxton watched with the expression of a man recalculating. King Oriana watched and said nothing and let her go. She needed air. She needed to think somewhere that was not a room full of people whose opinions she had been subject to for longer than she could accurately remember. The palace moon garden was empty at this hour. A long-walled space behind the eastern wing, full of winter bare rose arches and stone benches, and a small fountain that had been turned off for the cold season. The sky above it was a pale, clean grey. The cold was the kind that sharpened thinking rather than numbed it. She heard him come through the garden gate behind her. She did not turn around. I told you, she said. I will not be married out of pity. I know. Or out of guilt. She turned then, and she looked at him steadily. You stood in that chamber, and you said true things, and I am grateful for the truth. But gratitude is not a vow. And a man apologizing in public does not automatically become a man who sees me. He did not argue this. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention she had first noticed in her cottage. Complete, unhurried, slightly unsettling in its honesty. I have seen your cottage, he said. I have seen the jars on the shelf, and the ledger, with 6 years of records, and the cabinet your mother built, and the path you walk at dawn, and the crimes, where you speak to a child in pain. I have seen your mother's shawl, and what she hid inside it for you to find. I have seen what you did in the council chamber today. You came alone, in a plain dress, carrying your mother's book, and you waited for the truth to be enough. He paused. I do not know everything about you, but I know that I have not been looking at a rumor since yesterday morning. I have been looking at you. Gina was quiet for a moment. The garden held them in its cold stillness. If I say yes, she said slowly, what becomes of my cottage? It remains yours. What becomes of the Moonwell? You guard it. It is yours by bloodline, and by the pack charter, and I will put that in writing before the councils and after it. She looked at him. Something in her expression had shifted. Not softened, not yet, but opened slightly. Like a door that has been closed for so long that even an inch of movement is significant. What becomes of my voice? She asked. Her voice was quiet, but it was the quietest part of her. The part that had been asking this question in one form or another for her entire life. He stepped closer. Not dramatically, just close enough that she could see his face completely, could see that he was not performing the answer. "It becomes," he said, "the voice my counsel learns to fear before they lie." The cold air moved between them, and for a moment she simply looked at him. This man who had insulted her before he had ever looked at her, who had then come to look at her in plain clothes and found that she was nothing like the insult, who had stood in her mother's cottage and held her hand still over a locked cabinet and asked if she should have to stand alone. She did not say yes in the garden. She walked alone to the palace chapel, while the light was still grey and the day was not yet decided. The chapel was small, stone, and old enough that the wolf symbols carved into its arches were different from the official ones, used in council chambers, older forms, rounder and less aggressive. Candles burned at the far end, making shadows that moved like company. Lyra found her there, not because anyone had sent for her. Lyra had ridden to the capital at dawn, the way she always arrived wherever Gina was when things were serious. She sat beside Gina on the stone bench and said nothing for a while. Then, "Are you afraid?" "Yes," Gina said. "Of him. Of being wrong." She looked at the candles. "I have been very good at knowing when men wanted something from me that was not me. I am less practiced at the other thing." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "He stood up in the council chamber," she said, "in front of every person in that kingdom who has ever mocked your name, and he told them they were wrong. He did not do it for policy. He did not do it for the land." She paused. "He did it because he went to see you, and he came back changed," Lyra said softly, "is not the same as surrendering yourself. You taught me that. You told me that a woman who knows her worth does not lose it by sharing her life. My mother said that, and your mother was right. She usually was." Gina sat with it for a long time. The candles burned. The chapel was warm and still. When she finally stood, her face had settled into something that was not certainty. She was too honest for certainty, but something adjacent to it. Decision. The kind that has been weighed properly and committed to clearly. The temple was full by morning. Word had moved through the palace and the capital in the way that significant things always moved, not through official announcement, but through the particular current of a kingdom that understood something important was happening and wanted to witness it. The council was present. The gallery was full. Daxton Blaze was notably absent. He had been escorted from the palace the previous evening by Axel Riker and 2 royal guard, accompanied by paperwork that Oriana had signed before he went to sleep. Gina entered alone. She wore her mother's blue shawl over a simple silver gown. The shawl was old and slightly worn, and absolutely out of place in a formal royal temple ceremony. She wore it anyway. Her hair was properly arranged for once, and there was no ink on her hands, and her chin was level. She walked the length of the temple without hurrying. At the altar, Oriana waited. He was dressed in royal black, formal coat, council insignia, the full regalia of the king of the Moonspire Kingdom. But his crown was not on his head. It sat on the altar beside him. He had placed it there before she arrived, because there was something he wanted to establish before anything else, that the man standing here was not only the crown. Quietly, in a voice that carried through the silent temple, "Do you still pity the man who marries me?" The temple held its breath. Oriana looked at her, at the blue shawl and the steady hands and the eyes that gave him nothing he had not earned and everything he had. And he said, "No, I envy him." The silence broke, not in chaos, in something warmer. In the particular sound a room makes when it has witnessed a reversal it did not expect, and finds, to its own surprise, that it is moved. The vows were spoken. They were simple and direct, and without flourish, the old pack form. Presence, protection, partnership, permanence. Gina said them without trembling. Oriana said them without breaking her gaze. When they were done, the temple doors opened to full morning light, cold and bright and winter clear, spilling across the stone floor, and across both of them in a wide, clean sweep. They stepped through together, not as a rescued woman and her savior, not as a king and his conquest, as 2 people who had walked through a difficult week, looked at each other honestly, and chosen. Justice moved more slowly than ceremony, but it moved. Daxton Blaze's council title was stripped within 48 hours of the hearing. His family's petition was formally invalidated and sealed in the public record with a notation of fraudulent foundation. The forged debt document was marked void and placed in the Moonspire legal archive as a reference case for future council review. Daxton himself was not imprisoned. Gina had not asked for that, and Oriana had honored her lead. But he was permanently removed from any council, advisory capacity, and required to make a public correction of the record regarding the 3 engagements he had orchestrated. Elder Kathleen Draven and Valerie Zane were formally required to correct the statements they had made in their official files about Gina. Kathleen did it in writing, stiffly. Valerie did it in person, which surprised everyone including Valerie, and which Gina received with more grace than Valerie had any right to expect. Not everyone who had laughed at Gina's name changed their minds immediately. Some bowed when she passed through council corridors because they were required to. Some genuinely did not understand what they had participated in and would not understand it for some time, because that is the nature of people who have never been on the receiving end of a story told about them without their consent. But Gina had stopped waiting for consensus. She had stopped waiting for it a long time ago, if she was honest. She had not moved entirely into the palace. This had been discussed, and Oriana had not pushed it. The cottage remained hers, fully and legally, with the royal seal on the title documents to prove it. She stayed there 3 days a week, treating border patients, walking the boundary, checking the Moonwell records that she was now formally and publicly recognized as keeper of. On those days, Oriana sometimes rode out in the early morning and arrived at the gate while the mist was still over the fields. She would hear hoofbeats on the path and look up from her work to find him at the gate, in plain clothes again. But honest plain clothes now. No pretense. Just a man who had discovered that he liked the quiet of the eastern border better than he had expected. She would open the gate without ceremony. He would come in and work beside her. And these hours were different from everything else in both of their lives. Quiet, ordinary, warm in the specific way that the right kind of company makes ordinary things feel full. He learned the names in her ledger. He learned which families needed which medicines and in what season. He learned that Winnie Kale liked to talk about her late husband for exactly 10 minutes every visit before she would accept help with anything, and that Finn Harrow's mother would not look you in the eye while you were treating her son because she was too grateful and didn't know where to put it. He learned what Gina had been doing here, alone, for years, in the space that everyone had decided was not important enough to protect. The first time he sat at her small table with a cup of something warm and watched her work in the evening firelight, she looked up and caught his expression and said, "What?" He said, "This is where I should have met you first." She set down her pestle and looked at him for a moment. "No," she said, "you met me when you needed to. Any earlier, and you would not have known what you were looking at." He thought about this for a long time. She was right. He had needed to hear the story told without his better judgment present, before he could be shown how wrong the story was. He had needed the exact wrong version, first, so that the right version could hit with its full weight. He crossed to the table and sat across from her. The fire crackled. The herbs on the ceiling beams made the room smell like a forest after rain. Her mother's shawl hung on its hook by the door, slightly more worn now along the hem where Gina had opened the seam to find the hidden page. He reached across the table, and his hand found hers, unhurried, undemanding, simply present, then turned and held. Outside, the mist moved over the fields. Inside, the cottage was warm. They stayed like that for a while, both of them looking at the fire, not needing anything more from the moment than what it already was. The royal decree that Oriana issued in the first month of their partnership was not long. Legal documents rarely needed to be long to be powerful. It stated, in clear, clean language, that no woman of any pack within the Moonspire Kingdom could be entered into a marriage petition process, formal or informal, without her own sworn statement being the first document on record, not the petitioner's, not the council's summary, hers. In her own words, acknowledged by the council, read aloud in open session before any other proceeding could advance. It was named the Fenrir voice right. Gina had not asked for it to carry her name. Oriana had insisted. In the council chamber, the same stone hall where her name had been used as a punchline 3 weeks ago, she now sat beside the elevated table, not on it, not behind it, beside it. Her chair was at the same height as the council chairs. She was not elevated above them, and she was not placed below them. She was in the room, on equal ground, with her mother's ledger on the table in front of her, and her ink-stained hand resting openly on the cover of it, making no attempt to look like something other than what she was. The first case that came under the new decree arrived before the month was out. A young woman named Sarah Rogue stood at the council floor in a brown wool dress, her hands linked in front of her, her chin up, but her eyes moving around the room with the particular expression of someone who has learned to look for exits. She had been presented with a marriage petition by a council family, and she did not want it, and she did not know if she was allowed to say so. Gina rose from her chair before anyone else could speak. She crossed to the council floor and stood beside Sarah, not in front of her, not speaking for her, but with her. The way you stand with someone who needs to know the ground is solid before they will risk the next step, she said, simply. Tell us what you want, prepared to fight, and has just discovered they may not need to. She said, I want to refuse, and they did. Oriana watched from the high table. He watched the way Sarah stood straighter after Gina spoke to her. He watched the council members look at the new decree on the table in front of them and reach, slowly, for their pens. He watched Gina's face as she stood beside a young woman who needed someone to show her that the room would hold her weight. He had said, in the garden, that her voice would become the voice his council learned to fear before they lied. He had been right about the fear. He had not anticipated the other part, the way her presence in a room changed what people believed was possible, not through authority, not through force, through the simple, radical act of being undeniably herself in a space that had tried for years to make her smaller. She was not behind the throne, she was beside it, and from the high table, watching her, Oriana understood fully and without remainder what he had almost never been allowed to be in a room full of powerful people, telling him comfortable things. He had almost been wrong. In time, he would be grateful for every moment that had brought him to that cottage gate, in plain clothes, with nothing to offer but his own willingness to look. The Alpha King had once pitied the man who would marry Gina Fenrir. He knew the truth now. The man who married her was not pitiful. He was the luckiest man in the Moonspire Kingdom, and she had not made him that by becoming easier. She had made him that by refusing to become smaller,